Top news of this evening, Harden to the Cavaliers, yet another photo shot for the man with the biggest beard.
This last trade deadline was nasty, and it's sure to have some ripple effects that affect the next couple of years of the league. Which got me thinking, what are some of the deadline deals of the last 10 years that have had ripple effects we can now properly evaluate? For the purposes of this video, deadline just means really close to the deadline, not necessarily the day. And no, we're not covering Luka here. Let's let a few more years pass before we start milking that again.
I think what will be interesting for Wiggins, Rachel, is, they're going to ask him to play less of a role, have less of a burden than he had in Minnesota.
This next trade directly ended up becoming one of the most important of the decade, even though it only lasted for a bit. Golden State's dynasty had basically been in the blender. KD gone, Klay was out, Steph had barely played, and the Warriors' 2020 season became more about draft positioning than anything else. So when they ended up with D'Angelo Russell, it always felt like a temporary arrangement, as he didn't really match the long-term shape of what they were going to be once the real Warriors came back. Minnesota, on the other hand, had been chasing Russell for years, and eventually decided to just pay the price to pair him with Cat. So at the deadline, Golden State received Andrew Wiggins, a 2021 first-round pick which was top 3 protected, and a 21 second-round pick. The Timberwolves finally got what they wanted in Russell, plus Jacob Evans and Amari Spellman. At the time, most of the conversation was about Wiggs. When talking about fit once Golden State regrouped, he'd been the dream name you heard. For years, the talk had been about his contract and empty calories, how he was talented but frustrating, the guy everyone kept waiting on to reach expectations. As it wasn't happening the way the 2015 hype predicted, the Warriors were trading for a version of Wiggs that didn't have to be the guy. Maybe he couldn't be an MVP, but the talent could fit with the winner. Defending, cutting, and being athletic next to the veteran Warriors were the requirements. And then there was the part everyone ignored at first, the future pick baked into the trade. That protected Minnesota first eventually conveyed, and the Warriors used it to draft Jonathan Kuminga, a situation which may or may not still be panning out by the time of this post. By 2022 though, Wiggins was one of the Warriors' most important two-way pieces as expected, and he had moments on the biggest stage where he flat out swung season-deciding matches. In Game 5 of the finals, he put up 26 points and 13 rebounds in a win that put Golden State up 3-2. When Steph needed a number 2, of all people, it was him. To this day, I believe he quietly carries the tag of having been the second most important player on a championship team. It was one of those rare deals where a team took a bad contract, quote unquote, and had it pay off. No pun intended. Added to the list of moves here, which eventually did result in the promised land.
The Nets have to make the finals. Let's just assume for a second that Kyrie is on the team and will play for the Nets at some point this season. This is the only big three in the NBA.
By the time the James Harden trade finally happened in 2021, his relationship with Houston had soured pretty badly. He wanted out. He made no effort to hide it, and management gave in after years of coming up short. Of all teams, it was Brooklyn who pulled the trigger and formed what was supposed to be the ultimate cheat code. It was one of the last times a franchise went all in on chasing an offensive supernova, and the price was one of the reasons. It was astronomical. The Nets took on Harden and a 2024 second-round pick. Houston received Karis LeVert, 3 unprotected first-round picks, and 4 unprotected pick swaps, plus Dante Exum and a 22 first-round pick via Milwaukee from Cleveland. The Cavs were able to grift Jared Allen and Taurean Prince, Allen still remaining the centerpiece of this Cleveland run. At the time, Brooklyn had handed Houston control over their draft fate for basically the rest of the decade. It was one of the deals over the years which messed with the market, as the price of a star nearly became unaffordable, and illogical in the goal of building a championship team. Yeah, this was title or bust, as failure to win anything meant they also potentially had no easy ways out. Attempting one of those ultimate trios with little real backline support in hindsight was a huge gamble. They were good as they were, but the arms race of the 2010s generally taught teams to beat everyone else to the punch with this type of opportunity. If you didn't, somebody else would. By the end, Brooklyn became a reminder that super teams weren't invincible anymore in the era of nonstop injuries and rosters built on thin margins. Meanwhile, Houston showed why when you reach the end of a star's timeline, if they're in their prime still as James was, it's generally a pretty good idea to get it over with. They continued flipping the fallout into assets, which brought them near the top of the West just last season. This trade ended up becoming one of the clearest examples of the modern NBA's two extremes. Technically, Brooklyn is still in rebuild mode from this, though they were at least able to dig themselves out of debt when they had almost no way to rebuild.
The Pacers have completed the trade of Pascal Siakam.
With all that's happened to Indy in the last year, it's difficult to remember it came together with a 2024 trade people didn't think was moving the needle too much. Tyrese had established himself as a cornerstone of the franchise, but as to not waste his timeline, where was it headed next? Who'd be his partner in crime to score when the game slowed down? Being a small market team who almost never got a big name free agent, they paid for a legitimate prime level co-star. On January 17th, Indiana acquired Pascal Siakam in a deal that was technically a 3-team construction, but the headline was simple. Toronto cashed out its last championship era star in Siakam, receiving Bruce Brown, Jordan Nwora, Kira Lewis Jr., and 3 first-round picks, including 2 in 2024 and a future Pacers first that was protected near the top. People had been wondering when Toronto would finally give up the core which had been disintegrating since Kawhi split town. Siakam was now approaching free agency, which left an obvious choice. Next to Hallie, he'd serve as a second star who could score without needing the whole offense built around him, bolstering the half-court offense even though he could also run the floor with him. While it was an obvious risk, we see teams today who've acquired a star in the past with no real direction on how to get their support to the next level. Immediately making it to the conference finals, Siakam agreed to a 4-year max contract to stay and build. As we now know, things worked out almost immediately. We could very well be talking about them easily going to a second straight finals in 26 if not for the tragic injury, but even then, they might just come back even better next year. All things considered with how it ended up, Pascal Siakam to Indy might be the best under-the-radar trade of this century.
Word has it that they just want to start all over. You know, the DeMarcus Cousins experiment wasn't working. You know, him and AD is an impressive lineup. Both the guys averaging 20 and 10. The last Twin Towers to do that was David Robinson and Tim Duncan.
These days, you hear rumors for weeks. Hell, you pretty much hear the actual deal a day before it's done. The DeMarcus Cousins trade, however, came to us during All-Star Weekend in New Orleans, which kind of felt on the nose. He was literally at the event doing media, and in the middle of an interview, you could see his reaction as he learned the information. The Pelicans received DeMarcus Cousins and Omri Caspi, with Sacramento getting Buddy Hield, Tyreek Evans, Langston Galloway, and a protected 2017 first-round pick along with a second-round pick. Boogie Cousins in his prime was quietly sent to play with another dominant big in a fairly lackluster deal. By 2017, it was pretty clear he was leading yet another dead-end era. ESPN reported a source saying the Kings' owner love for Buddy Hield was a major driver in the deal. The specific quote was basically that the owner saw, quote, Steph Curry potential in Buddy. Believing they had a nice rebuild piece, the deal was done without a ton else to show for. For New Orleans, however, it felt groundbreaking. In that stretch of the NBA, small ball was on a seemingly irreversible tear, ending the careers of many traditional bigs if you'll recall. Teams were downsizing, spacing the floor, switching everything, to which I can even remember Tim Duncan being benched a year earlier against Golden State due to playstyle. So when New Orleans paired Anthony Davis with DeMarcus Cousins, it felt like an experiment from a totally different timeline. 2-star bigs in their prime who could score in the post, face up, rebound, pass, and what answer would any team have for this if they built it correctly? As we know nearly a decade later, they sadly never really got the chance to finish the plan. Cousins and AD put up an incredible mixtape for the small time they did share the floor, but in January 2018, Cousins went down with what was later confirmed as a ruptured left Achilles. The injury ended both any hopes of the duo and essentially Cousins' entire career. At this point in time, he was also due to be a free agent, while AD's future was very much in question. The timing meant New Orleans would obviously have little interest in taking him back, meaning time for Davis was likely up as well. DeMarcus went on to try and grift the ring with the KD Warriors, while Davis did end up a champion a couple of years later in Los Angeles, of course.
I think it was a great upgrade to go out and get Serge Ibaka. They didn't give up a lot. It's an upgrade.
Well, I mean, he is an upgrade at the center position there, and finally we have an arms race in the East, right?
Multiple times throughout the 2010s, Masai would quietly slide a new ingredient into the Raptors recipe, making them fit for an eventual champion. Only no one took them seriously until the biggest move with Kawhi. Yet, before the championship run, there were 2 deadline deals that basically tell the story of Toronto's evolution. The first was Serge Ibaka. At the 2017 deadline, they were once again good as they had been for years by now, but you just knew they were missing something to beat a LeBron roster. Defensively, they needed a guy who could provide real presence up front, switch when needed, but not further kill the spacing. So they made the move, sending Terrence Ross and a 17 first-rounder to Orlando for Serge Ibaka. It was a giant step towards actual winning playoff basketball in later rounds, less based around vibes and guard play. But as important as Ibaka was, the next deadline move put a cherry on top of the transformation. In 2019, the Raptors were already all in, acquiring Kawhi over summer. The East was also now completely wide open with tougher teams and no LeBron Big Three to deal with. Any team with the right moves had a shot to at least see the finals, where anything could happen with a little luck. In Masai fashion, as the team was already looking elite, he sent from Marc Gasol, whose best days were a bit behind him. In accordance, it only cost him Jonas Valanciunas, DeLon Wright, CJ Miles, and a 2024 second-round pick. It wasn't exactly making waves, as common thought still favored Golden State versus anyone in a series. However, quietly, Toronto had committed to a specific type of basketball, where Jonas gave you size and production, Gasol provided elite defensive IQ, a special level of passing from a big at the time, and a body you could throw at the biggest problems in the East. Suddenly, they were stronger for the late round half-court wars. That's why I chose to combine these deals, as years apart, they solidified the front court to eventually bring the franchise its first and still only title. With the size, athleticism, and versatility of Toronto's front line as a whole, it really is an underrated what-if looking at a unit who essentially had only a few months together.
On January 31st, you tweeted, quote, "The energy is about to shift." Where were you when you sent that? What made you say that?
When the 2022 trade deadline came up, somehow the energy in Boston had indeed shifted. So instead of a huge splash, a potentially under-the-radar upgrade that could change the way a playoff game felt when it slowed down was in order. On February 10th, the Spurs agreed to send Derrick over, just a few short years after he'd randomly impressed in the playoffs. San Antonio received Josh Richardson, Romeo Langford, a top 4 protected 2022 first-round pick, and a 2028 first-round pick swap. It may have seemed like a bit much to some, but Boston had picked up a playoff connector for a unit who were regularly getting close to finishing the job. White gave them another guard who defended, and could function next to either of the Jays without turning the offense into your turn, my turn. He'd already proven he could do what mattered in spring, and boy was it a hit. They flipped into a terrifying version of themselves, using defense to choke the life out of teams and suddenly looking more than capable to emerge from the East. Meanwhile, his parent team had cashed a good player out into future flexibility. They didn't wait for the value to drop, as they were handling their first rebuild in decades. Years later, this trade basically aged into the perfect example of why contenders kept paying these prices. White continues to play an important role in their success in the present day, after having helped them to 2 finals and yet another conference finals appearance. When they could have panicked over Tatum's injury and flipped him last offseason, they stood pat, and currently continue to contend in the East despite a much weaker roster. For all the hate Boston gets, they've continuously made the correct moves behind the scenes.
This is a guy that also plays well without the ball, a guy with great length on the wing position that could possibly match up with a LeBron James or Kawhi Leonard. Remember, the Nuggets lost a key piece in Jeremy Grant this offseason, so getting Aaron Gordon was huge for them.
Wow, it's strange to already be able to discuss huge trades in retrospect that don't feel so far away. Denver already had the MVP level center in 2021, a year after having made the West Finals. They had the scoring guard who looked like he'd break out into a superstar any minute, the shooting. What they didn't have was the kind of forward every contender eventually realized they needed. A big, athletic defender who could guard about any position while still contributing to the offense. So at the deadline, while Orlando was somehow still in the process of ridding themselves of the weird, insanely mid-2010s core, Aaron Gordon was finally moved. Being a local myself, I'd been waiting for the day he found a better franchise where he could blossom. The potential was there. That year on March 25th, with the deadline being later because of the remaining COVID weirdness, Denver acquired Aaron Gordon and Gary Clark, while Orlando took back Gary Harris, RJ Hampton, and Denver's 2025 first-round pick with protection. I made a video just days later pointing out the supreme fit he brought with Jokic. In my mind, they'd went from a solid team to real contenders. Being able to guard elite wings while cutting without clogging Jokic's space, we hadn't even gotten to the part where he'd become an elite spacer. Up to the end of the 2021 season, he shot 32% from 3. In the last 2 years, he's upped that by 10. Although Murray's ACL took the next 2 seasons of contention off the table for Denver, they immediately took the crown when finally healthy in 23, and today with their strongest supporting cast since, have a beautiful chance to win a second. This is easily one of the strongest deadline deals of the decade, and it felt like the obvious move if you knew what the Nuggets needed at the time.
Also for Brooklyn, they were ready to be done with this Kyrie Irving situation. They got back what they hoped they would.
A lot of these trades were ones which felt marginal or just not blockbuster. We're now approaching that territory. Kyrie's situation in Brooklyn looked over the minute he turned into a part-time player over COVID. It just took a little longer to materialize. In 2023, Dallas jumped in and took a swing people don't remember could have gone the other way. They received him and Markieff Morris, with the Nets obviously headed for rebuild, acquiring Spencer Dinwiddie, Dorian Finney-Smith, an unprotected 2029 first-rounder, and second-round picks in 2027 and 29. Remember, the trio attempt almost completely gutted their future, and to this point, nothing had worked out. For the Mavs, it looked a little desperate considering he could possibly leave over summer, but Luka was too good to keep waiting around. Already having lost Brunson where there wasn't much they could have done, going backwards for years from the conference finals appearance was risky. They needed another high-end creator next to him, so they bit in an iffy situation. They passed the first hurdle when that summer, Kyrie agreed to return on a 3-year, $126 million deal. From there, he ended up playing a major role in Dallas's ceiling later, aiding in their first finals run since 2011. Unfortunately, the risky part of this deal kicked in a year later when they shipped Luka out for another injury-prone guy, and he's now continuing rehab on the ACL tear where we will not see him in the 2026 season. Funny enough, with Luka ousted, the idea had been to use Kyrie as a leader with another duo guy in AD to continue competing. Or at least this is what Dallas ended up selling. His story with the franchise is to be continued.
Breaking news. Late night on the West Coast, early morning on the East Coast. The Nets they're no more, at least as they started this season.
Also back in 2023, the Suns had allegedly changed the temperature of the entire league overnight. Funny to remember, but before the Luka trade, it was the random explosive deal you either were or weren't awake for. With both Kyrie and Harden having been shipped off not long after KD had inked an extension, there was great wonder about where to go next since the timeline of Brooklyn's franchise clearly had come off the rails. Suddenly, we got the alert that Phoenix had taken the swing. Only a year removed from their only finals appearance in nearly 50 years. Phoenix, still housing an aging Chris Paul, clearly felt their title window had to be cashed immediately. Kevin Durant and TJ Warren joined the fray in exchange for Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, 4 first-round picks, and a 2028 first-round pick swap. And in the full multi-team version of the deal, Jay Crowder was routed out as part of the same larger transaction, officially ending a funny subplot nobody really remembers. At last, Brooklyn had salvaged a future they totally gambled away in hopes of the offensive juggernaut winning titles. Luckily, there was tons of value to extract from the stars despite injuries barely giving them any time together. They could restart from here, while Phoenix had now taken their spot, readying the title or bust timer. Initially, just posting the core on paper looked daunting for other units. In practice, like any super team attempt, they were now just one injury away from oblivion. As we now know, they did falter, emptying the clip even more that summer for Bradley Beal, then just recently had to reset as best they could, which has worked out at the time of this video. The results of deals like this continue to pile up on the negative, which is a strong reason I suspect you see current stars taking longer than usual to be moved, amongst other things like the CBA.
If the Nets get everything or almost everything in addition to Simmons, there will be a trade. And I think, look, both teams got what they wanted. I think it's a good trade for Brooklyn, a good trade for Philly.
To round things out, it's appropriate to finish here with more of Harden's early 2020s drama, especially considering what just went down a couple of weeks ago. By February 2022, like Harden before him, the Ben Simmons situation in Philly had turned into pure gridlock. Where Harden basically just came out and told Houston to trade him years earlier, it was even worse for Simmons as he wasn't even playing. After things fell apart in the 21 playoffs, tension grew between the sides and Ben forced the issue, indirectly holding Embiid's contending window hostage. Though it lined up perfectly because even this early, Brooklyn was now needing to plan their next phase only 1 year after creating that trio. On February 10th, the two linked up for a very sensible move both ways. The Nets sending Harden to create a potentially exciting duo with Joel in exchange for Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, Andre Drummond, and 2 first-round picks. Still having Kyrie at the time, technically they were both still contenders in the East. Through this method, they could both move on from their headaches while more so retooling than starting over. Harden's Philly run had highs, but it capped out about where most fans expected given the history of the two stars. The Sixers would again need to change the process a little over a year later. Meanwhile, the reality of Ben Simmons turned out a lot scarier than the idea. Had he returned at his best, Kyrie and KD could have caused problems in the conference, but he didn't play at all in 2022. and there was limited time in 23 before everything finally broke apart. He wasn't great there either. Ultimately, neither team got what they wanted out of it, but it's one of the rare times where two volatile situations involving high-profile players were supposed to be one another's solution.